It is the winter of 1942, and the war has ground itself into something grimly mechanical. Deep beneath the Admiralty building on Whitehall, in a basement office that smells of damp paper and strong tea, a young physicist named Dr. Edmund Croft is staring at a page of equations that should not, by any reasonable measure, be a weapon. Outside, the blacked-out streets of London are still being reshaped by German bombs. The Blitz has technically ended, but the scars have not. Croft's equations, scratched across 3 sheets of foolscap in a hand so precise it might belong to a clockmaker, describe something that has nothing to do with explosives, shrapnel, or the familiar violence of modern warfare. They describe sound. Not sound as a metaphor, not sound as an alarm or a signal or the bark of a commanding officer. Sound as a physical force, as pressure, as vibration, as a phenomenon that can, at the right frequency and the right amplitude, do something extraordinary to the human body without leaving a single visible mark. The equations describe what happens to a man's inner ear when exposed to sustained infrasound at precisely 18.98 Hz. They describe what happens to his sense of balance, his vision, his capacity for rational thought. They describe, in the bloodless language of physics, how a person might be rendered entirely unable to fight, not through injury, but through confusion so total it becomes indistinguishable from madness. Croft sets down his pencil. He picks up his tea. He stares at what he has written, and somewhere in the calculation of wave frequencies and resonance chambers, he understands that what he is looking at is either a breakthrough or a dead end, and that the only way to know which is to build it. What he cannot know, sitting in that basement in 1942, is that the device he is about to propose will spend the next 8 decades locked inside a filing cabinet in Kew, that it will be tested, refined, argued over, and ultimately set aside, not because it failed, but because it worked rather too well, and in entirely the wrong direction. This is the story of the Resonance Project, Britain's forgotten sonic weapon, the device that could confuse German ears without firing a single shot, and why it never got the chance. To understand why anyone in wartime Britain would spend precious resources investigating the weaponization of sound, you have to understand the particular texture of desperation that defined British military thinking in the early 1940s. The war was consuming materiel at a rate that staggered the logisticians. Shells cost money, bombs cost money, and men cost everything. The strategic question driving a dozen secret departments buried in the machinery of Whitehall was simple and brutal. How do you defeat an enemy at the lowest possible cost in blood and treasure? The answer, pursued along several unconventional tracks simultaneously, kept returning to psychology. The Germans were not simply outgunned adversaries. They were disciplined, well-supplied, and, critically, well-motivated. The Wehrmacht soldier of 1942 was a formidable opponent. Breaking his will to fight through conventional means required killing or wounding enough of his comrades to make resistance feel futile, and that process was slow, expensive, and far from certain. What if there were a way to make him feel futile without touching him? What if the battlefield could be made to feel wrong, profoundly, physically wrong, in a way that no amount of ideological conditioning could overcome? The answer, it turned out, lay in a frequency range that human beings cannot consciously hear but can absolutely feel. Infrasound, sound below approximately 20 Hz, travels extraordinary distances, penetrates solid structures, and interacts with the human body in ways that had been documented in anecdotal accounts for decades. Operators of large industrial machinery reported unexplained anxiety and visual disturbances. Witnesses to certain meteorological phenomena described a pervasive sense of dread that preceded any conscious awareness of danger. Organ pipes in churches, operating at the very bottom of their range, were known to produce what congregations described as feelings of awe or unease. These were not mystical experiences, they were physics. The challenge was that no one had ever successfully weaponized them, Previous attempts to harness infrasound for military purposes had run into a problem so fundamental it was almost comic. Sound waves of very low frequency cannot be directed in a tight beam. Spread them across a landscape, and they affect everyone equally, including your own side. The German engineers who experimented along similar lines in the 1930s had encountered exactly this difficulty. Their methane-powered acoustic cannon, which pulsed at roughly 44 Hz rather than the more potent infrasonic range, could theoretically produce nausea and disorientation at 200 to 400 meters. But it was enormous, ungainly, and deafeningly obvious. It also had the unfortunate tendency to disorient its operators as thoroughly as its targets. Sound, it seemed, refused to be partisan. What Croft proposed was different. Rather than generating infrasound and pointing it at the enemy, he suggested a system for delivering it covertly, hiding it inside ambient noise, embedding it within the ordinary acoustic texture of a battlefield so that no German soldier could identify the source, or even be entirely certain that what he was experiencing was external rather than internal. The facility to which Croft was eventually assigned was HMS Birnbeck, a requisitioned pier structure on the Bristol Channel at Weston-super-Mare, an improbable setting for some of the most unusual weapons research of the entire war. Run by the Department of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, known affectionately to its inhabitants as the Wheezers and Dodgers, Birnbeck was home to a rotating cast of physicists, engineers, and what the official records describe only as specialists in human physiology. The DMWD had been established in 1941 specifically to pursue ideas too unconventional for the mainstream defense establishment, and Croft's proposal, which had been bouncing around Whitehall for the better part of a year, finally found a home there in the spring of 1943. The device that emerged from 18 months of development at Birnbeck was designated, in the careful language of wartime classification, as Apparatus, Acoustic, Disorientation, Mark I, though within the project team it was referred to, with the mordant humor characteristic of the DMWD, simply as the murmur. It was not a cannon, it was not even, in the conventional sense, a weapon. It was a generator. Specifically, a resonance generator designed to produce sustained infrasound at frequencies between 17 and 19 Hz, modulated in a pattern that Croft's research suggested would maximize the physiological effect on the human vestibular system. The murmur was built around a pair of large resonance chambers, each roughly the size of a domestic wardrobe, constructed from laminated oak and steel and connected by a series of carefully calibrated baffles. Air was forced through these chambers by an electric compressor. In early prototypes, this was a modified industrial unit salvaged from a printing works in Bristol, and the geometry of the chambers caused the air column to oscillate at the target frequency. The sound produced was not loud. By conventional measures, it was barely audible, a faint, almost subliminal throb, like the lowest note of a cathedral organ felt in the chest rather than heard with the ears. But at distances of up to 400 meters, under the right atmospheric conditions, it produced in test subjects a reliable constellation of effects: mild but persistent vertigo, a tendency to misread distances, a subtle but measurable degradation in the ability to track moving objects visually, and, most significantly, an elevated psychological state that subjects consistently described as unease, dread, or the conviction that something was about to go wrong without being able to say what. The unit weighed approximately 340 kilograms and could be mounted on the standard four-wheel trailer used by Royal Artillery units. 2 men could have it operational within 40 minutes of arrival at a position. At full output, it drew roughly the same electrical power as a large domestic cooker, achievable from a portable generator, though not trivially so. The effective range varied considerably with atmospheric conditions. Best results were obtained in cold, stable air with low wind, when the team recorded disorientation effects at ranges approaching 600 meters. In warm or turbulent conditions, the range dropped below 200 meters, rendering the device tactically marginal. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Field testing of the murmur was conducted between August and November 1944 at a site in the Brecon Beacons in South Wales that the War Office had requisitioned for experimental purposes. The test subjects were volunteers from a Pioneer Corps battalion, men who had been told they were participating in a study of battlefield noise and its effects on operational performance. They were not told what they were really experiencing, which creates an ethical dimension to this story that the classified reports declined to examine in any depth. The results were striking, within limits. Subjects exposed to the murmur at 300 meters in optimal conditions consistently showed measurable impairment on tasks requiring spatial reasoning and visual tracking. Several reported experiences that, in the clinical language of the evaluation reports, are described as transient perceptual anomalies, what the men themselves apparently called, in the rather more direct language of the Pioneer Corps, seeing things that weren't there. 3 men reported experiencing what the medical officer's notes characterize as acute anxiety episodes, though all recovered fully within hours of exposure ending. Crucially, none of them could identify the source. When questioned after each trial, the test subjects attributed their experiences variously to tiredness, the cold, something they had eaten, or, in one memorable entry in the field notes, to the suspicion that their mates were winding them up. This was precisely the effect Croft had been trying to achieve. The enemy, it was theorized, would not merely be disorientated. He would be confused about the cause of his disorientation, which was an entirely different and in some ways more paralyzing condition. What was actually planned for the murmur, had it gone forward, remains a matter of inference rather than documented fact. The operational files contain proposals. None of them progressed to formal plans, suggesting deployment alongside coastal defense positions in the event of German invasion, as a means of degrading the performance of assault troops during the critical early hours of a landing. There are also sketched proposals for use on the Western Front after D-Day, specifically in support of night operations where German infantry were being asked to hold positions under sustained pressure. The logic, as Croft expressed it in a memorandum dated March 1944, was that a man who cannot trust his own senses is a man who cannot fight effectively, regardless of how many rounds of ammunition he has been issued. The Germans, for their part, were pursuing broadly analogous ideas through rather different means. The Luftwaffe had conducted limited research into the use of acoustic phenomena to disrupt Allied aircrew, and the Wehrmacht's Technical Bureau had examined infrasound as a potential anti-personnel measure in the early years of the war. The difference, as Croft observed in the same March memorandum, was that German research was focused on generating intense sound as a physical shock weapon, something that caused direct physical damage at close range, while his own work was aimed at something subtler and, he argued, considerably more militarily useful, a device that did not merely hurt, but genuinely confused. The American approach was different again. By 1944, OSS research units in London and Washington were experimenting with acoustic psychology through broadcasting, playing specific sounds over loudspeakers at volumes that crossed the threshold of physical discomfort, with the aim of demoralizing enemy troops. The famous Ghost Army units deployed in France during 1944 used sound trucks to simulate the presence of large armored formations, a form of acoustic deception that was highly effective but operated on an entirely different principle. The Ghost Army was telling the Germans a story. Croft's device was trying to make it impossible for them to read the story they were already living in. The murmur's story ends not with a decision, but with an absence of one. By the autumn of 1944, the strategic situation had changed dramatically. The Allied advance through France and Belgium was proceeding, fitfully but unmistakably, in the right direction. The resources required to move the murmur from a promising field experiment to a deployable weapon were substantial, not so much in financial terms as in the time and engineering attention of people whose skills were being pulled in a dozen directions simultaneously. The DMWD's formal assessment, completed in December 1944, concluded that the device had demonstrated genuine potential, but that the variability of its effects under battlefield conditions, combined with the logistical demands of its power supply, made it impractical as a near-term operational weapon. It was to be retained for further study. Further study never came. 2 prototypes were built in total. One was stored at Birnbeck until the facility was decommissioned. The second spent some years in an Admiralty warehouse in Portsmouth before being dismantled for parts, or so the available records suggest. The project files, classified under the standing secrecy provisions that applied to all DMWD work, were retained in Whitehall and transferred eventually to the Public Record Office at Kew, where they remained closed until a routine declassification review in the early years of this century brought them, largely unnoticed, into the public domain. The actual historical impact of the Resonance project, assessed with the cool eye of hindsight, was essentially nil. It was never used in combat. It never saved a life or cost one. It sits in the archive as a record of human ingenuity operating in a context of extreme urgency, arriving at a real discovery and then running out of time before the discovery could become an asset. Whether it would actually have worked on a battlefield under real rather than controlled conditions, with German soldiers rather than Pioneer Corps volunteers as the test subjects, is something that cannot be answered from the available evidence. What the project does illuminate is the breadth and seriousness of British thinking about non-conventional warfare at a period when conventional warfare was consuming the nation's resources at a devastating rate. The Weasers and Dodgers were not eccentrics playing at the margins of the war effort. They were serious scientists and engineers trying to solve real military problems through means that the mainstream establishment either had not considered or had considered and dismissed. Some of what they developed, the Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar, the acoustic countermeasures deployed against German homing torpedoes, entered service and made a genuine difference to the war's outcome. The Murmur did not. But the fact that it very nearly did tells us something important about the nature of British wartime science, that it was capable of asking the strangest possible questions in the most rigorous possible way, and of building the answers in oak and steel. Return for a moment to that basement on Whitehall, to Dr. Edmund Croft and his page of equations, and the damp-smelling room where a different kind of weapon was being imagined into existence. He could not have known, working those numbers in the winter of 1942, that what he was describing would spend the next 80 years in a filing cabinet. He could not have known that the war would end before his device had the chance to prove itself, and that the particular kind of confusion he had so carefully engineered, the confusion of a man who cannot trust his own senses, who cannot say whether the wrongness he feels is outside him or within, would remain, for the time being, a theoretical condition rather than a deployed one. What he did know, what the equations on that page insisted upon with the implacable authority of physics, was that sound was not merely a byproduct of the world. It was a force that moved through solid matter, through air, through the fluid of the inner ear and the tissue of the brain. It could be shaped, it could be directed, it could be made to do things to a human being that the human being would not understand and could not resist. The technology was real. The question was whether the moment was right. The moment, as it turned out, was not. The Murmur was filed away, and the war moved on without it. But the idea did not disappear. The principles that Croft worked out in a wartime basement, infrasound, resonance, the vulnerability of the human vestibular system to sustained low-frequency pressure, became the foundation of research programs in several countries in the decades that followed. Whether any of those programs owe a direct debt to the Resonance Project is not something the declassified records make clear. The history of secret research is full of ideas that were independently rediscovered because the human capacity for insight does not respect the classification system. What remains, in the end, is a handful of documents in Kew, 2 sets of field trial results from a wet Welsh hillside in 1944, and the ghost of a device that sat in a Portsmouth warehouse until someone decided they needed the parts. There is no surviving example of the murmur. There are no photographs of it in operation. There is only the paper trail of an idea that was right and came too late and was quietly set aside in the way that wartime necessity has always set aside the things it cannot use in time. The British built a weapon that could reach inside a man's head without touching him. They built it quietly, in a requisitioned pier on the Bristol Channel, out of laminated oak and surplus compressors and the very particular genius of a physicist with a gift for frequency. They tested it on a Welsh hillside and watched men lose confidence in their own perception. And then they put it away, because the war was ending and there were other things to attend to. That is perhaps the most British ending imaginable. Not a dramatic failure, not a triumphant success, but a careful, competent piece of work that arrived just slightly too late to matter, filed away with a note suggesting further study in a country that was already moving on to the next problem. The weapon that confused no German ears because history, in its usual untidy fashion, refused to wait.